Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. It is so nice to be online with all of you today. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville. My name is Danielle Garrett. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm serving as your student minister this year. Whoever you are and whatever road has led you here this morning, know that you are welcome here. We are so glad you've come to worship with us. As Unitarian Universalists, we do not share a common creed, but rather covenant together to affirm our interdependence, celebrate our differences, and promote justice. On Sunday mornings, we bring our whole selves, our many names for the divine, and our diverse spiritual paths and join together in worship. Through joyful music, quiet prayer, and thoughtful words, we seek to honor that which we hold most sacred and affirm our congregation's mission to create community, nurture spiritual growth, and act on our values in the broader world, guided by reason and compassion. I'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone this morning who is visiting for the first time. If you are seeking a spiritual home, we hope that you might find it here. If you're joining us live this morning and you feel comfortable, we'd love for you to say hello in the chat so we can welcome you. You can find helpful resources and more information about our congregation by visiting our website at firstuunash.org. You can also feel free to direct message me on Zoom this morning or reach out via my email address, studentmin, M-I-N, @thefund.org for more information about our congregation. One quick note before we begin, we will not be doing live joys and concerns this morning, but any joys and concerns that you've shared in the online forum will be passed along to your lay ministry team, and you can always reach out to them directly with any care needs. We are so glad you are all with us this morning. Welcome.
Good morning. I'm Gail Spar. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be our song leader for this morning. Our opening hymn is Come, Come, Whoever You Are, with words adapted from the Sufi mystic Rumi. Won't you join us in spirit as we sing this beautiful song?
Though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, 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 though you've broken your vows, come, yet again come, yet again come, yet again come.
And I'm our worship associate this morning. In the book of Hebrews, we are told, don't neglect to open your homes up to guests, because by doing so, some have been hosts to angels without knowing it. I don't know about angels, but I know about my holy, messy, amazing fellow humans. So in this virtual service, as we welcome each other into our individual homes, cars, workplaces, waiting rooms, wherever we might be, may we embrace the holiness of welcome and of being welcomed. Let us come together in worship. Our chalice lighting this morning is from Janet Parsons. The flame of our chalice this morning is a symbol of the warmth and brightness of our connections. The flame lights our way back together again from our separate lives, and it lights our way forward into this new year of promise and renewal. Our story for all ages this morning is called The Hugging Part. Many years ago, I took a month-long class in Salzburg, Austria, and used that as an excuse to travel around in Europe. And toward the end of the trip, a friend of mine and I were wrapping up in Vienna, Austria, and they speak German there. I speak pretty good German. My friend didn't speak German really at all. Because we didn't have very much money, we decided the best way to see the main cathedral, really big church in Vienna called St. Stephen's, was to attend a service there, a Catholic mass, because that's what they call their worship service, because there was a charge to visit the cathedral during the week as a tourist. But if you went on Sunday, it was free and you could look around if you weren't super obvious about it. So my friend was raised Catholic, and because I'm a musician, I've attended a lot of Catholic masses in my life. And they are really, really different from UU worship services. For one thing, they're always the same. Week after week, everywhere, any Catholic church you go to are going to be about the same. And so when you go to one, if you've been to one before, you know what to do. So when my friend and I went together, we knew what to do. She knew what to do, even though she didn't speak the language. And the cathedral was beautiful. The music was really great. And we were pretty glad we were able to be there. And there's this moment called passing the peace. It happens at other churches too. And you may have noticed when we're together in person, it happens at our church. It's usually at the beginning. It's where we're told to greet our neighbors. And so before the pandemic, everyone would stand up in their seats and they turn to everyone they can reach and they shake hands or hug. And in the Catholic tradition, they say, "Peace be with you." My friend, because she didn't speak the language, hadn't been able to follow along with the service. But she immediately recognized this part of the service and excitedly said, and literally bounced, when she said, this is the hugging part. And she grabbed me in the biggest, warmest hug. I was also able to shake hands with the Austrians and maybe some tourists around me, some of whom recognized my friend and I as North Americans, so said, "Peace be with you" in English. And some of whom we passed the peace with in German, saying, "Friede sei mit dir." And I love this part of the service. I loved this part of the service, and I love this part of our service, because it helps me as a stranger feel welcome and included. I felt like part of the congregation in that moment in a church, not of my own religious tradition, it was over 4,000 miles from home. I miss that part of our services at First UU Nashville, where we greet each other. Sometimes I even miss the hugging part, even though I'm not always much of a hugger. So when I see people in person now, I try to smile with my eyes and my voice to feel connected to them, even when I'm wearing a mask. If I think there's a level of comfort, I ask if I can hug them. Consent matters. And online in meetings or worship services, I always try and take a second to look at everyone in the grid view on Zoom and wish them, at least from my heart, peace. So peace be with you, or Friede sei mit dir.
You may know that we share every Sunday's collection with an organization whose work outside our walls aligns with our values. Our Share the Plate partner for the month of January is the Healing Arts Project, which provides artistic opportunities for persons in mental health and addiction recovery to promote healing, community awareness, and inclusion. You can find the link to our online donation form in the chat or by visiting firstunash.org. The offering is a sacrament of the free church. It is supported by the voluntary generosity of all who join with us. As always, your gifts, like your presence among us, are received with gratitude.
Our next hymn is From You I Receive, and we'll sing it through twice. From you I receive, to you I give, together we share, and from this we live. From you I receive, to you I give, together we share, and from this we live.
I'm assuming, since I'm at the center of the screen, that there's no introduction and I'm just supposed to jump in. So if that's what you have in mind, that works for me. Good morning, everybody, and Happy New Year. You should never start off with a negative, but I was so looking forward to being with you in the sanctuary. And this is it's a poor second. I really love the spirit of the church. I love the music. I just love the presence of the people. And I hope that the pandemic lets up enough that we can get back to doing that. So the theme this morning is hospitality. And I wanted to start with what Jessica opened with a little while ago when she quoted from Hebrews. Now, I'm not quoting, I'm just paraphrasing. But what I got out of it was St. Paul, or as I usually call him, Rabbi Saul, says that you should open your home to strangers because you never know if the people you are embracing are in fact angels. Now, I may have missed something, but if that's the point, that hospitality is based on the fact that you might be entertaining angels, and you certainly don't want to disrespect them. So you better, keep your house open to people. I don't think that's his point, but if that's the point, he's missing the point. The reason I don't think that's the point, and the reason I don't think that's really what he had in mind, is because he's coming out of the Jewish tradition, and one of the central themes of Judaism is hospitality. So he's sort of highlighting one of the core teachings that he grew up with. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at the primary story of positive hospitality in the Bible. There's a negative story. There's the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that's talked about in the book of Genesis. We're never exactly sure why the towns were destroyed. People like to insert their favorite, whatever their favorite evil is. They want to say, oh, that's what the people were doing, and that's why God destroyed them. But in the rabbinic tradition, out of which St. Paul comes, the thing that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah failed at, and that triggered their own destruction, was their inhospitality, their refusal to welcome strangers. And that's what caused their destruction. So Judaism, from the Bible forward, is rooted in the ideal of hospitality. But the story of hospitality is earlier in the book of Genesis. It's in chapter 18. I'm just going to read a part of it just so you hear it. So God appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. So just so you know, Mamre may have been the sacred grove. And there's a lot of speculation that Sarah, which the name means princess, that Sarah was a priestess of a nature-worshiping religion devoted to the Divine Mother through the, I don't know if you want to say avatar, but through the presence of trees. And that's why Abraham and Sarah were camped in the groves of Mamre. That was a sacred place for her. So it says, God appears to Abraham in the oaks of Mamre as Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent at the hottest part of the day. Abraham looked up and he saw three men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them, and he bowed down to them. And he said, "Honored sirs, if I find favor with you, don't pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come into the home of your servant," meaning Abraham and Sarah. So there's a lot to unpack in this story. I mean, it seems simple enough, but this is a Jewish text, so nothing is simple because we love to complicate things. So let's just go through it a bit at a time. So the story opens with God appearing to Abraham. God says nothing to Abraham. And Abraham says nothing to God. There's no welcome, there's no command, there's no conversation. And there is in other parts of the story, but not here, not in these opening verses. So God appears to Abraham, which, well, I mean, if God appeared to me, I would find quite impressive. But Abraham doesn't seem moved at all. Instead, he looks away from God and he sees three people coming. And then what does he do? He just leaves God standing there and he runs to see these people. Abraham looked up and saw three men, and he ran from the tent entrance where God was to meet these people. From the rabbinic point of view, what the story is saying is, if you have to choose between opening your house to God and opening your house to people, go with people first. That it's the welcoming of the human that is at the heart of religiosity, not the welcoming of God. Now, you could have a theology like mine, which suggests that all people, all beings, the entire universe is a manifesting of God, so that welcoming anyone or any being into your home is a welcoming of God. But that's a little sophisticated for this text. So the rabbis are simply saying, if you have to choose people over God. There's a similar teaching in the same rabbinic literature that says, if you're planting a tree and the townspeople are rushing by you and they're calling to you and they're saying, the Messiah has arrived, come and greet him. The rabbinic position is, first plant the tree and then go meet the Messiah. In other words, your everyday life, whether it's welcoming people or planting trees, is more important than the supernatural occurrences of God arriving at your entrance or the Messiah coming. So Abraham looks up, he runs out to the people. And then he says to them, if I find favor with you, don't pass by. Let me bring you some water. Let's wash your feet. And you can rest yourselves under the tree. Now, this is taking place in the oak groves of Mamre. So there's zillions of trees. But he doesn't say you can rest under the shade of a tree or you can rest under the shade of the trees. He says rest under the tree, as if he had one tree in mind. And according to the ancient literature, he did. There was one tree that was sort of a magical tree. Whenever I read about it, I always think in terms, now I do anyway, in terms of the magical hat in Harry Potter that tells you what house you're going to, be established in. You'd sit under the tree, and then the tree would bend over you if you were a good person, in other words, provide you with shade, or the tree would turn away from you if you were an evil person. So while the Bible doesn't say this explicitly, the rabbinic literature is saying, come, let me give you some water. You can wash your feet, and let me check out your credentials. Let me see if you're a good person or a bad person, and sit you under the magic tree and let the tree tell me what your character is. So he welcomes everybody, but he does take care that he's not bringing someone evil into his house. Along the same lines, the rabbinic tradition says that Abraham and Sarah had a unique custom regarding the way their tent was established. In their time, we just know historically that the people of that time, they're all nomads, so they all lived in tents. And the tradition was to open only one flap of your tent, and you kept everything else locked down. And the idea was, if strangers came by, they would have to, if they were going to attack you, they could only attack through in one direction, through the open flap. That was the norm, to open only one of the four flaps. But Abraham and Sarah had a different custom. Their custom was to open all four flaps. Everything was open to the elements. Everything was open to anyone who came from any direction. They were fearless, even though Abraham had his testing tree. They were, in this notion of the four open flaps, they were fearless when it came to strangers. Anyone coming from anywhere could come and find refuge with them. So there's two things so far that you have to keep in mind. One is people trump God when it comes to hospitality. And two, fearlessness is essential to the way we greet the stranger. So we could just leave it there, I suppose, and say this is just a practical thing. I mean, don't cultivate fearlessness, open all four aspects of your all four flaps of your tent. But the rabbis, again, complicate things. They bring more into it. It can't be that the Bible is just talking about physical tents, according to the rabbis. They're talking about each one of us. And that each one of us has, we'll say, tent flaps, ways of closing ourselves off to the world. And we tend to open, this is the theory, we tend to open that flap with which we are most comfortable. So, maybe you're, whether or not you're a hugging, maybe you are a hugging person. And so the flap you open is the physical flap, or maybe you're more an emotional person. So you open the emotional flap, or maybe you are an intellectual person or a spiritual person. I mean, in a sense, if you don't mind mixing metaphors, the four flaps are, at least in my mind, the four kinds of yoga in the Hindu Vedanta tradition. The karma yoga, the yoga of service. If that's your yoga, then you open the flap of service, and that's like Abraham, you rush out to help people. Could be the yoga, bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. And so you open the flap through which the divine, you believe the divine enters. It could be Raja Yoga, the yoga of contemplation, and you open the flap of contemplation and close the others. Or it could be Jnana Yoga, the yoga of wisdom, the yoga of study, the yoga of knowledge, and you open that aspect of your life because that's where you're the most comfortable, and you keep the other flaps closed. The rabbinic tradition says, as I think so does the yoga tradition, you have to keep all four flaps open. You have to be vulnerable physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. You have to be open to whatever reality brings in any of those four dimensions. Along the same lines, the rabbis say another way to read the four flaps is through action. That that you have to stay open to doing. The way they talk about it is doing, feeling, thinking, and being. So it's very similar to what I just went through, but it's doing in the world, being focused on action. Then there's a flap where it's just feeling, and you don't really have to do anything. You just are content, or maybe obsessed with your own feelings. The third is to make everything an abstraction, the intellect. And the fourth is to sort of transcend, but not in a healthy way, but to transcend the physical world and focus on the spiritual. So that's the one that the story in Genesis itself clearly rejects, because here's God. And then Abraham says, hold on, God, I got to go talk to these people. So clearly, Abraham is not drawn to the spiritual in the sense of leaving behind or paying no attention to the actual physical, practical world. He says nothing to God, just leaves God standing there and runs out to talk to these people. Okay, so what do we make out of all of this? So Paul says, open your house to everyone because you don't know if they're divine or not. My suggestion is open your house to everyone because everyone is divine, but also open yourself to all four dimensions of encounter with the world. And the way you do that, there is no one way. You have to find your own way. Which flaps are open, which flaps are closed? You have to look into your own life to see, I mean, and I can say this just for myself, my preferred flap is the intellectual flap. That's always open. I'm always interested in new ideas. I'm always interested in people who are going to share, teach me something. I'm not so interested in the physical or the emotional or even the spiritual. If I have to choose between the spiritual and the intellectual, I prefer the path of jnana yoga, wisdom yoga, to the path of Raja yoga, contemplative yoga. Now, knowing that about myself, I've got to learn to open the other three flaps. I've got to find a way to be more engaged in the world, find a way to be more engaged in contemplative practice, though I have a daily practice. I don't know what I would do in addition. And I have to find a way to become more vulnerable emotionally. And knowing that, it sets a spiritual task for me for the coming year, you might say, but in general, that I try to open all four flaps. And I would offer you the same challenge. What flaps are open? What flaps are closed? And how might you open the ones that are closed so that you can welcome whoever comes into your life from whatever direction in the next, I would just say, because it's January 2nd, in the coming year. One last thing I want to share about this. Back in the beginning of the story, God appears to Abraham. Abraham runs to the stranger. What is Abraham doing when God appears? Nothing. Abraham's just sitting at the opening of his tent. So if we didn't know that all four flaps were open in the tents of Abraham and Sarah, if we just, saw Abraham like an individual who closes three of the four flaps, I think you could argue that he is most comfortable at the flap of contemplation. He's sitting, he's meditating. That's one of the rabbinic interpretations of this. He's meditating at the opening of his tent, which the way I'm explaining it here, he's got the flap of contemplation open. He's meditating in that open space, and then God appears to him. But so in that sense, he receives the presence of God. It's passive. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but it's not active. He's just sitting and he's waiting, and the flap is open and God appears. When he notices, because other flaps are open, when he notices the flap is open and that there are humans coming, now, like Paul says, and he's probably thinking of the story, these humans happen to be angels, but Abraham doesn't know that, and neither does the reader at this point. He sees three people coming. When he sees them, then he acts. There's no action in the arrival of God on Abraham's part. When he sees the people, then he acts. He leaves behind the transcendent and engages with the immanent. Now, he doesn't know they're angels, but once you discover they're also divine beings, what it's saying is God is both transcendent and immanent. God, the kingdom, if you like, is both within us, that's the strangers coming to us, and beyond us, which is the divine appearing to us. What Abraham is doing is balancing out two fundamental aspects of spiritual practice. One is the aspect of surrender, where God comes to you, and the other is the aspect of action, where you reach out into the world. The way it's put in Genesis a few chapters earlier, when Abraham and Sarah are commanded to go out to the promised land ultimately, the way it's expressed there, it's in chapter 12, verse 3. The whole point of the spiritual is to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And that's what I think the story in Genesis 18 is. He's open to the divine manifesting. But the work of being a blessing is the work of being a blessing to, in this case, people. I mean, you could say animals and other things, obviously, but in this case, these three strangers. Welcoming the stranger is a way of welcoming, of doing the work of being a blessing. Welcoming the stranger is the way of achieving your really the highest goal of a human being, which is to be a blessing. Welcoming the stranger is the way that we discover the divine in the midst of the everyday, rather than waiting for God to appear to us in some transcendent, supernatural way. So my hope for the coming year, for you, but also for me, is that and I won't speak for you, but I'm hoping you're thinking something similar, that I have the courage in the coming year to find which flaps are closed, and then to open them, and then to sit in a state of radical vulnerability, which is necessary for this absolute hospitality we're talking about, to sit in a state of radical vulnerability in order to become aware of whenever the stranger comes, that I might not simply wait for the stranger to arrive, but to actively go out and meet what is unknown, and in this way discover the divine. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that made sense to some of you. And again, thank you for having me.
Our final hymn this morning is "Soon the Day Will Arrive," and I hope you will join in the singing.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Our closing words are by Maureen Killoran. No matter how weak or frightened we may feel, we each have gifts that can make a difference in the world. In this coming week, may you do at least one thing to support the broken, to welcome the stranger, to celebrate what is worthy, to do the work of justice and love. Be strong, be connected, go in peace.